Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Harbour midweek mini. Thanks for joining me today. This is the second of two little talks on the theme of the coming of Christ. And I know it's not a sort of light topic, but I nonetheless feel that it's a really important topic for us to get to grips with as Christians. And as I said last week, I've always found that advice really helpful, that we should major on the things that Jesus majored on and minor on the things that Jesus minored on. And Jesus' teaching on the end time is really quite a central part of the gospel message. So at some point in our Christian walk we do have to tackle it, and we have to examine it and look at it. And I've tried to do it from a slightly different angle. And I last week really focused on the Old Testament, and I tried to show you that the Old Testament is actually full of references, prophetic references to the ultimate return of Christ, the second coming of Christ. And that the Hebrew scriptures reveal this moment, often called the day of the Lord, when God returns to gather and to save his people, but also to judge wickedness. And it's a day described by the prophet Malachi as a day that is both great and terrible. And I always feel like it's great for those that know and fear and love God, and terrible for those that don't. And what I also tried to show you, that the day of the Lord, the coming of the Christ at the end of the biblical narrative really, and the end of history as we know it, is not actually the end. That there is a continuation of life on earth after his coming, and it's a continued life that has Christ at the centre, and he sits on his throne, the throne of David, as the son of David, and establishes a new kingdom in which righteousness and peace reign. The interesting thing is that we can learn all of this without any reference to the New Testament at all. But when we do look at the New Testament, we discover that everything we read there, it tallies very closely with that of the Old Testament. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of the controversy and confusion that there so often is around the end times and understanding of the end times, a lot of that confusion would be got rid of if people spent longer looking at what the Old Testament had to say about the end of all things. And really, the New Testament and the Old Testament, they complement each other in this way. And the book of Revelation is a great example. I don't think you can really understand the book of Revelation without a really good grasp of the Hebrew scriptures. So I realise in this short time I'm not going to do the New Testament view of the second coming of Christ much justice, and it's going to be a bit sketchy, so forgive me for that. But as ever, you're free to go away and explore a bit more depth for yourself. And we're going to start by just looking very briefly at the words of Jesus. And as I said last week, in Matthew, Mark and Luke, there's quite extensive passages which discuss the end of the world. The chapters in particular are Matthew 24, Mark 13 and Luke 21. But in truth, references to the end times are scattered throughout the whole of the Gospels. And of course they are also in the book of John, in the letters, and ultimately in the book of Revelation. But we know these passages pretty well. If we've been around for a while and we've read our New Testament, we'll be familiar with the words of Jesus. And he says in Matthew 24, for example, verses 4 to 8, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumours of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains." And Jesus describes these end time troubles, tribulations if you like, as the beginning of the birth pains, the precursors. I like that image, because that always speaks to me of these pains being the precursors to life, a new world of righteousness and peace. But all three passages talk about these first pains, but then proceed to explore the events more specific and imminent to the coming of Christ. And it's almost like we transition from these early birth pains to an established labour. And this period of labour, to continue the analogy, consists really of three main things, which all happen probably at the same time. They all happen concurrently. And the first one is an end-time persecution of God's people. I know that's not a very cheery thought, but it seems clear both in the Old Testament and the New Testament that in the end days, God's people will suffer persecution. Matthew 24 verse 9, Jesus says, "You will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me." That's the first thing that I think it's pretty clear from both the Old Testament and the New Testament is going to be a feature of the end times. The second thing that happens, another feature of this end time period, are these disturbing events which happen in Jerusalem, involving, amongst other things, a flight of God's people out of Jerusalem. And Matthew 24 verses 15 to 16 says, "When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Again, language straight from the book of Daniel. The third thing that I think is a feature of this sort of middle period, if you like, of this labour, is the appearance of false messiahs and false signs. Jesus said, "For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time." And again, thinking back to the book of Daniel, Daniel also describes this coming of a wicked ruler who will persecute God's people. And as I said at the start, I know this feels a little bit gloomy, but I can't help feeling that Jesus taught these things to his disciples so that they would be written down and so that God's people would be in possession of the facts, the prophetic facts. And Jesus himself says there, "I have told you ahead of time," and this is something that Jesus wanted to tell us ahead of time. One thing to throw in here is really in relation to this, the accounts of Matthew and Mark, in which they both describe this abomination that causes desolation. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But interestingly, Luke describes something different. And Luke says this in verse 20, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city." So it's interesting, Matthew and Mark describe this end time event in which this thing called the Abomination of Desolation is set up, whereas that as being the point at which the people of Jerusalem should flee, whereas Luke describes the moment as the moment when the city is surrounded by enemies. And these two events they represent two separate historical moments in the history of Jerusalem, but are used by Jesus to speak of future end-time events, those sort of historical events which foreshadow end-time events. And this setting up of the abomination that causes desolation had actually happened nearly 200 years before the time of Christ, when the Greek Seleucid Empire, under this wicked king called Antiochus IV, persecuted the Jews, terribly, I hasten to add. And really he tried to wipe out the Jewish people, wipe out the Jewish faith. As part of that persecution against the Jews, which began in about 167 BC, a statue, probably of Zeus, was set up in the temple in Jerusalem, and they even sacrificed pigs on the altar. It was just like an attempt to commit sacrilege. And it was during that time that the Maccabees appear on the scene. They revolt against the Seleucids, and Israel ultimately, Judea ultimately experiences a period of independence. And you can read all about that in the book of 1 Maccabees, which you won't find in your normal Bible, but if you have a Bible with an Apocrypha, it is in there. So that's the first thing. Jesus uses this historical event to describe something of what is going to happen in the end times. The second event Jesus mentions, as I said, it's just in Luke, is this moment when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And when Jesus spoke these words, this still was a future event, and he was really speaking about the coming of the Romans. And we know that in AD 70, the Romans did indeed come, surround Jerusalem, and actually began previous to that. And it was a drawn-out period of the history of Jerusalem, pretty grim period, and you can read about it in Josephus's Jewish Wars if you're interested. But the city was surrounded. In fact, some Jews did flee. Some early Christians did flee, and they went to a place called Pella, and there's extra documentary evidence for that. But Jesus uses this actual event when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Romans and ultimately destroyed as another historical moment that would point to something of what would happen in the end times. So these are like two features of the end time period, using historical moments, historical events. After this sort of period of established labour, as I've called it, the end really does come quickly, according to the New Testament writings, and a period of God's judgment begins. We have to sort of distinguish between the suffering of the believers, of God's people. We have to distinguish that from, in many ways, from the judgments of God, which are released at a certain point in the end time events that unfold. And Jesus put it like this, and again, this is something which is spoken of in the Old Testament. There will be signs in the sun, moon and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And it's only at that moment when the heavenly bodies are shaken and a great earthquake is described in the book of Revelation and in the Old Testament too, it's at that point that the Son of Man returns, that the Christ returns. So that's a sort of sketchy overview of what the New Testament has to say about the coming of Christ. We haven't, of course, gone into what Revelation has to say, but we'll touch on that in a moment. But there's a couple of thorny issues that we just need to deal with, and I'm almost reluctant to go there because people get very sort of hot under the collar about it. But I'm just going to present my view with an open hand, and you can go away and decide for yourself, and of course disagree. But the first thorny issue is the question of where the church will be at the time of great tribulation that comes upon the world, and particularly the events of Revelation. Where will the church be? And it's actually a very popular teaching, and I've heard some sort of big names in the Christian world promote this idea that the church will not be present when the troubles described, particularly in the book of Revelation, begin to happen. And this word rapture is sometimes used, that the church is going to be raptured, it's going to be taken up out of the way, and because the church is no longer present, because God's people are no longer present, everything is going to descend into sort of moral and spiritual chaos. And people normally use the passage from 1 Thessalonians 4 to justify this view. It says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and left will be caught up," that's the key word, "together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever." And there's a really long, difficult to pronounce anyway, Greek word for this being caught up with Christ, and it's harpazo, page sometha, which in the Latin was translated as raptura, from which we get the word rapture. I can't go into all the ins and outs of this, but the point is, some people push this view that the church is going to be removed and it's going to be raptured before the sort of horrible things described in Revelation begin to happen. And one of the things they say is that the evidence for this is that the church is not mentioned in the book of Revelation. And it's not absolutely true to say that, of course, because Revelation 1 to 3 concerns the church in particular. And Revelation 4 to 19, it is notable that the church is not mentioned. But I think there's a very good reason for this. And first of all, I would say Revelation 1 to 3 does concern the church, and it is the sort of bookend of what is known as the age of the Gentiles. And if you read those passages carefully and the letters to the churches very carefully, you'll see that all of those churches are being told to hold on, to stay faithful until the end. And it's difficult to sort of decode because if you have to remember that the book of Revelation was actually a letter written to churches being persecuted in the 1st century AD. And there were a number of serious persecutions, and probably Revelation was written just after or even during those persecutions. I actually think Revelation was written around AD 70, and probably John is speaking to the churches that had suffered from the Neronic persecutions, which had claimed the lives of many Christians and claimed the lives probably of Peter and Paul, amongst others. So we have to understand that Revelation was a letter written to the persecuted church of the 1st century AD. And that said, it also speaks timelessly or across time into a future time when the church will once again be persecuted. And I believe the word there is those 3 chapters is to the Gentile church, telling them to be faithful, telling them to stand firm, telling them to continue in the things that they'd learnt and not to be lukewarm, etc., etc. Why the church isn't mentioned in Revelation 4 to 19, I think is there's a very simple reason, and the reason is, I believe, that those chapters primarily concern God's dealings with the Jewish people, and that God hasn't yet finished with the Jewish people. And again, I can't go into the details, but my belief is that there are 3.5 years prophetically sort of owed to the Jewish people. And when the time of the Gentiles comes to an end, as Jesus refers to the years belonging to the Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles, when those years come to an end, there is still a little bit of time in which God works in his own people, the Jewish people. And this period is 3.5 years, and it comes out in the book of Daniel, but it also comes out in the book of Revelation in a number of places. It's referred to as a time, times and a half a time, 1260 days, 1260 days, and 42 months. And it's my belief that this period of 3.5 years is what Revelation primarily concerns, and it is that persecution that breaks out against Christians, and it is the appearance of this wicked individual at the end of time that is the spark that ignites the events of Revelation 4 through to 19. And I suppose that in some ways brings up the second thorny issue, which is when is Revelation referring to? Has some of Revelation already happened? And you've probably already picked up that I believe that the book of Revelation concerns a future event or future events. And it's, in that sense, I sort of have a futurist views that these things haven't yet happened. Sometimes people try and match things that are happening in the world today with things that are happening in the book of Revelation, but I believe that those events are for a time that is yet to come when God turns his attention back to Israel, in which a persecution breaks out against God's people. And in fact, those seals that are broken in Revelation 6, the first 4 seals are released these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And if you look really closely at that text, you begin to understand that those 4 horsemen are persecutorial spirits sent out against God's people. And there's like economic persecution, there's religious hatred and persecution, and this persecution leads to death. The last horseman that comes out is death, and Hades follows on behind. And what's interesting is that when the 5th seal is opened in Revelation 6, what do you see? You see the vision of the martyrs. So this period of great persecution, particularly in the Middle East, breaks out against Christians. And it's in that context that those final events begin to unfold. And of course, Revelation 11 also talks about this appearance of this wicked individual that sometimes referred to as the Antichrist, and in Revelation 11 is referred to as the beast, and along with the beast there is the false prophet. So these things, although they're written sort of sequentially, they all sort of happen concurrently in my view. But all of these events that take place, the appearance of this wicked individual, the abomination that causes desolation, which may indeed be this individual making an appearance in Jerusalem, all the celestial signs that follow, they're all the prelude, the precursor, if you like, to the ultimate coming of Christ. And I love how in Revelation 19 we get this wonderful image of the coming Christ that fits in so well with what we've learned from the Old Testament. And John says this in Revelation 19 verse 11, "I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse whose rider was called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like a blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one but he himself knows. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." And going back to that first thorny issue which I mentioned, I don't really see that there's any evidence that the church is not present in these end time events, because the persecution is against God's people. And it's clear to me that it's at the point that Christ eventually returns that he gathers his people to himself. And he gathers, if you read through Revelation, you'll see he gathers the Jewish people first, and then he gathers the Gentiles to himself. So there's a lot to sort of get our heads around there, but I think the bottom line is the church has to go through this. Christ is going to be with his people during this time, and he is going to shield and help and provide for his people during this time. Judgment will come upon the wicked, and ultimately God's church will be gathered to Christ at the time of his coming, and we will be with Christ forever. That's what it says in the letters. So I know it's a sort of slightly heavy topic, but I think it's important that we have our eyes open. I think it's important that we're aware of what the future holds. And as Jesus said, that we are not alarmed, but that we are rather prepared and trusting in him in the days that unfold, that he will lead his people ultimately into safety and salvation. So it's good news. Bless you lots. Thanks for listening, and I hope some of that was helpful.